I'll give you my entire salary. If you can translate this, the Millionaire CEO said with a smirk, his voice cutting clean through the polished silence of the boardroom, as if he had just made the easiest bet in the world. And for a second, no one breathed. Then the laughter came, low at first, then louder, echoing off the glass walls and marble floors. The kind of laughter that wasn't meant to be funny but to remind someone exactly where they stood. And Sophie Bennett stood right there, near the door, her fingers still wrapped around the handle of a mop, her cleaning cart parked beside her like a quiet witness to everything she was never supposed to be part of. She hadn't meant to be seen. Not like this. Not in the middle of a high-level executive meeting where men in tailored suits discussed numbers bigger than anything she had ever earned in her life. She was supposed to slip in, wipe down the floors, empty the trash, and disappear before anyone noticed. But now all eyes were on her, and at the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, tall, composed, effortlessly expensive, the kind of man who didn't just run a company. He owned every room he walked into. His watch probably cost more than Sophie's rent for a year. His posture relaxed like this was just another moment of casual entertainment. He held up a document, a thick stack of papers filled with dense paragraphs in a language most people in the room didn't recognize, and he tilted his head slightly, studying her not as a person, but as a curiosity, as if wondering how far this little joke could go. Well, he added, his tone light, almost playful, but there was something sharper underneath it, something that turned the air colder. Sophie's heart pounded once, hard enough she felt it in her throat. She could walk away. She should walk away. That would be the smart choice, the safe choice, the invisible choice she had mastered over the years, because invisibility was survival when you were the kind of person people overlooked on purpose. But her feet didn't move. Her grip on the mop tightened just slightly. Her eyes dropped for a fraction of a second to the worn notebook tucked into the side pocket of her cleaning cart, its edges frayed, its pages filled with notes written in cramped handwriting no one had ever bothered to ask about. Then she looked up again, and something in her expression shifted, subtle but undeniable. The laughter around the room began to fade, not because anyone said anything, but because there was a pause, a hesitation, like the moment before a storm changes direction. Ethan noticed it too, his brows lifting just a fraction, curiosity replacing a sliver of his amusement. Sophie stepped forward, just one step, but it felt louder than all the laughter that had come before it. Her shoes barely made a sound against the polished floor, yet every eye followed her. She stopped at the edge of the table, close enough now to see the document clearly. Lines of text she recognized instantly, not as something foreign, but as something familiar, something she had spent years studying before life had forced her down a different path. Her hands trembled for a brief second, then stilled, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, and completely different from what anyone in that room expected. "Are you sure?" she said, lifting her gaze to meet Ethan's directly for the first time. "You want to make that bet?" For a moment, no one moved, not even Ethan, as if the entire room had been caught off guard by the simple steadiness in her voice. Not loud, not defensive, just certain. And that certainty did something unexpected. It shifted the weight in the room, just enough to make the air feel different. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her now with a sharper focus. The faint smirk still there but thinner, more curious than amused. "I do not make bets I cannot afford," he said smoothly, his tone drawing a few soft chuckles from the executives around him. But this time the laughter felt uncertain, like it was waiting for permission that had not fully arrived. Sophie gave a small nod, almost to herself, as if confirming something only she understood. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the document he held, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before taking it. The paper felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented: expectation, judgment, and every quiet moment in her life when she had chosen not to speak. She exhaled slowly, her eyes scanning the first page, and the room watched, at first with amusement, then with curiosity, and then, gradually, with something else, because Sophie did not frown, she did not struggle. Her eyes moved steadily across the lines as if she had seen this kind of text 100 times before. Ethan noticed it first, the way her posture changed, the way her shoulders straightened just slightly, The way her grip on the paper became more confident. "Go ahead," he said, his voice softer now, almost inviting. Sophie lifted her gaze briefly, then looked back down, and when she began to speak, it was not hesitant, it was not broken, it was clear, precise, and completely fluent. The unfamiliar language unfolded into English effortlessly, sentence by sentence, not just translated, but understood, the meaning carried through with a level of accuracy that made one of the senior executives at the table slowly sit forward, his brows knitting together as he listened more carefully. Sophie did not rush. She did not perform. She simply read, explaining complex phrases in a way that made them simpler, sharper, more useful than the original text itself. The room grew quieter with each passing second, until the only sound left was her voice, calm and steady, and somewhere in the middle of it, the energy shifted. Completely, the earlier laughter now felt distant, almost embarrassing. Ethan's expression changed last, but it did change, the amusement fading into something far more focused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand not just what she was saying, but who she was, because this did not fit. None of this fit. Not the cleaning uniform, not the cart by the door, not the quiet presence she had been just minutes ago. Sophie reached the end of the page and lowered the document slightly. Her fingers still steady, her breathing even. She did not look around the room. She did not search for approval. Instead, she looked directly at Ethan, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "That is the first page," she said simply, her tone unchanged. "Would you like me to continue, or is that enough to cover your salary?" The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like something had just shifted in a way no one in that room had expected. One of the executives cleared his throat quietly, but did not speak. Another adjusted his tie as if suddenly aware of how small the earlier laughter had made him look. And at the center of it all, Ethan Caldwell remained still, his gaze locked on Sophie with an intensity that had nothing to do with amusement anymore. It was the look of a man recalculating everything in real time. "Continue," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. Sophie did not hesitate. She nodded once and returned her attention to the document, turning the page with steady fingers, and as she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision, but now there was a quiet confidence behind it, not arrogance, not defiance, just the undeniable presence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She moved through the text seamlessly, shifting between technical terms and nuanced phrases, occasionally pausing just long enough to clarify meaning, not because she needed to, but because she understood the difference between translation and comprehension, and that difference was what made the room lean in instead of pull away. One of the senior analysts at the table began taking notes. Another whispered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "That is accurate." And Ethan noticed every single reaction. He noticed how the room that had laughed at her was now learning from her, how the same people who had dismissed her presence were now hanging on her words. And for the first time that morning, he did not feel in control of the room. Sophie reached the final paragraph and slowed slightly, her eyes scanning the lines one last time before she spoke the closing sentences, tying the entire document together with a clarity that made the original version feel almost incomplete by comparison. Then she lowered the papers gently onto the table, her hands still, her posture composed, and for a moment, she said nothing. She simply stood there, allowing the silence to return. But this silence was different. It was no longer filled with mockery. It was filled with recognition. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on the table as he studied her, the faintest trace of something unfamiliar crossing his expression, not confusion, not irritation, something closer to respect, but not fully formed yet. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his tone direct, no longer playing to the room. Sophie met his gaze without flinching, her answer simple. "I studied linguistics," she said, and for a brief second, there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something that hinted at a story she was not offering. Ethan caught it. Of course he did. He was the kind of man who built empires by noticing what others missed, studied. He repeated, his voice quieter now, past tense. Sophie gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. "Life has a way of changing plans," she said, and that was all she offered. No explanation, no apology, just a fact. The room remained silent, waiting, watching, but Ethan did not look away. He leaned back slowly in his chair, exhaling as if something inside his carefully controlled world had just been disrupted in a way he could not ignore. Then he reached for the document, glancing briefly at the pages she had translated, before looking back at her. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the mockery from before, only a quiet, measured curiosity. "You are not what you appear to be, Miss Bennet." And this time, no one laughed at all. Sophie held his gaze for a second longer, not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as quiet acknowledgement. Then she gave a small, almost polite nod. "Most people are not," she said, her voice steady, and something about the simplicity of that answer landed differently than anything else she had said, because it did not try to impress. It did not try to explain. It simply existed, and for a moment, Ethan had no immediate response, which was rare, almost unheard of, in a room where he was always the one setting the pace, always the one deciding when conversations ended and who got to speak. But now the rhythm had shifted, and he could feel it, not just in himself, but in the way the room watched him, waiting to see what he would do next. He tapped his fingers once lightly against the table, a subtle habit when he was thinking. Then he stood, slowly, deliberately, the movement drawing every eye back to him. Re-establishing his presence without saying a word, he walked around the table, not hurried, not hesitant, until he stood just a few feet from Sophie, close enough to see the faint crease in her sleeve, the small ink stain near the edge of her cuff, details he would have never noticed before. "Finish your shift," he said, his tone even, controlled, but no longer dismissive. "Then come to my office." A quiet ripple moved through the room, executives exchanging brief glances, not speaking, but clearly registering the shift in attention. Sophie did not react immediately. Her expression remained composed, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a calculation, a question she did not voice. "Is that a request?" she asked after a brief pause, her words careful, measured, and that, more than anything, almost made someone at the table inhale sharply, because no one spoke to Ethan Caldwell like that. No one questioned the weight of his words. Ethan held her gaze, and for the first time, there was something almost resembling respect in the way he answered. "It is an opportunity," he said, not raising his voice, not forcing authority, just stating it as fact. Sophie studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "I will be there," she said, simple, direct, and with that, she stepped back, returning the document to the table with the same quiet control she had carried through everything else. She turned without waiting for dismissal, her hand reaching for the handle of her cleaning cart, and as she walked toward the door, the room did not return to its previous state. No one laughed, no one whispered loudly. Instead, there was a strange, lingering silence, as if everyone was still processing what had just happened. Ethan watched her until she reached the doorway, until her figure passed beyond the glass and into the hallway, and only then did he turn back to the table. But even as the meeting resumed, numbers and strategies and projections filling the air again, his attention was not fully there anymore, because something about Sophie Bennet did not fit into the structure he understood, and for a man who had built his life on understanding people, that was not something he could ignore. Hours later, long after the meeting had ended and the offices had begun to empty, Sophie stood outside a door on the top floor, her hand resting lightly against the cool metal handle. The hallway quiet, the city lights beyond the windows stretching out in every direction. She could walk away even now. She could pretend none of this had happened, return to the routine that asked nothing from her except silence. But instead she took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. The door closed softly behind her, the quiet click echoing more than it should have in a space that felt larger than life. Ethan Caldwell's office stretched wide with floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a living painting, lights flickering across the skyline in endless motion. Everything about the room spoke of control, precision, and power, and for a brief second Sophie felt it, the weight of stepping into a world that had never been meant for her. But she did not let it settle. She stepped forward, measured, steady, her eyes taking in the details without lingering. Ethan stood near his desk, jacket off now, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest long hours rather than effort. He was not looking at her at first, instead flipping through the same document she had translated earlier, as if confirming something only he could see. Then he spoke, without looking up, closed the door. Sophie turned, did as asked, and when she faced him again, he finally met her gaze, not with superiority, not with mockery, but with something sharper, something more deliberate. You translated it without hesitation, he said, setting the papers down carefully. Not just the words, the context, the intent. Sophie said nothing, her hands resting loosely at her sides. That document, he continued, was part of a negotiation we have been struggling with for weeks. He paused, studying her reaction, but she gave none, just that same quiet composure. My senior team had trouble with it, he added, and there it was, not an admission of weakness, but a statement of fact that carried weight. Sophie tilted her head slightly. Maybe they were overthinking it, she said calmly, and that almost made him smile. Not fully, just a flicker at the corner of his mouth. Or maybe, he replied, stepping closer. You are underestimating what you just did. The distance between them was still professional, still appropriate, but close enough now that the conversation felt different, more focused. Where did you study? He asked, direct. Sophie hesitated for the first time. Not long, just enough to acknowledge that the answer mattered. Columbia, she said, and that landed, not loudly, but unmistakably. Ethan's expression shifted again, a deeper calculation forming behind his eyes. That is not a place people walk away from easily, he said. Sophie's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second before returning. Some people do not get a choice, she answered. And this time, there was no room for follow-up in her tone. It was a closed door, and Ethan recognized it immediately. He did not push. Not yet. Instead, he turned, walking back toward his desk, picking up a slim folder from the corner. He held it for a moment, then extended it toward her. I am not interested in why you are cleaning floors, he said, his voice calm, controlled. I am interested in why someone like you is not sitting at this table. Sophie did not take the folder immediately. Her eyes moved from his hand to his face, searching, not for kindness, but for intent, because offers like this were never simple, never free. And what exactly are you offering? She asked, and again, that question, that quiet refusal to assume, to accept blindly. It did not challenge him, it engaged him. Ethan lowered the folder slightly, just enough to meet her at eye level. A position, he said. Temporary, to start, consulting, translation, analysis. He paused, letting the words settle. You prove yourself, it becomes permanent. Sophie remained still, the silence stretching just long enough to feel real, because this was not just an opportunity. It was a decision that could change everything, and she knew it. But she also knew something else, something just as important. And if I say no? She asked softly. Ethan held her gaze, unflinching. Then you go back to being invisible, he said, not cruel, not dismissive, just honest. And for a moment, that honesty weighed more than anything else he had said. The words lingered between them, not harsh, not softened, just true, and Sophie felt it settle somewhere deeper than she expected, because invisibility was not just a condition, it had been a choice she had learned to accept, one quiet compromise at a time. She looked at the folder still in his hand, then back at him, her expression unreadable for a moment longer before she finally reached out and took it, not eagerly, not reluctantly, just deliberately, as if acknowledging the weight of what it represented. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the contents, structured outlines, timelines, notes on international partners, dense but familiar, the kind of material she had once spent hours studying without being asked, without being paid, simply because she had loved it. A faint shift passed through her gaze, almost imperceptible, but Ethan saw it. Of course he did. He noticed everything that mattered. You recognize it, he said quietly. Not a question. Sophie closed the folder halfway, her thumb resting against the edge of the pages. I understand it, she corrected. And that distinction mattered, more than either of them said out loud. Ethan nodded once, as if filing that detail away. Then you understand the stakes, he replied, stepping back slightly, giving her space not just physically but in decision. This is not a test, he added, his tone steady. This is work, real work, with consequences that affect more than just this company. Sophie's grip on the folder tightened just a fraction, her mind already moving, analyzing, weighing, not just the offer, but everything that came with it. Because opportunities like this were never just opportunities. They were risks. They were exposure. They were the possibility of losing control of the quiet life she had built to survive. She lifted her gaze again, meeting his. "Why me?" she asked, and this time the question carried more weight, not curiosity, but caution. Ethan did not answer immediately. He considered it, not because he did not know, but because he chose his words carefully. "Because you did not hesitate," he said finally. "Because you did not perform, you did not ask for approval. You simply did the work." He paused, then added, "And because I do not ignore value when I see it." Sophie held his gaze, searching for something beneath the words, something that would tell her whether this was about opportunity or control, about respect or convenience. And what she found was not simple, not clean, but it was real, and that made it harder to dismiss. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the tension shifted into something more focused. "If I take this," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I do not want to be treated like a charity case, and I do not want to be your experiment." The words were clear, precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Ethan's expression did not change much, but something in his posture adjusted, a subtle acknowledgement. "You will be treated like an asset," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less." Sophie almost smiled at that, not because it was comforting, but because it was honest, and honesty, even when it was blunt, was easier to trust than empty promises. She looked down at the folder once more, then closed it fully, holding it against her side, the decision forming not as a leap, but as a step she could control. "Then I will take the position," she said, and for the first time since she had walked into that office, there was a shift in the air that felt like something beginning, not loud, not dramatic, just real. Ethan gave a small nod, not surprised, not triumphant, just acknowledging the choice. "Good," he said, turning slightly toward his desk. "Then we start tomorrow." And as simple as that, everything changed. The next morning did not arrive gently for Sophie Bennett. It arrived with the same quiet urgency that had defined most of her life. The alarm on her phone buzzing at 6:15, the pale gray light of early dawn slipping through the thin curtains of her small apartment. She sat up slowly, her eyes lingering for a moment on the folded cleaning uniform resting on the chair beside her bed. A habit, a routine, something familiar. But today it felt different, not gone, not erased, just no longer the only option. She reached for the folder resting on her nightstand instead, the one Ethan Caldwell had handed her, and for a second, she simply looked at it, as if confirming it had not been imagined. Then she stood, moving with purpose, the kind that came from knowing the day ahead would ask more of her than any day before. The building downtown looked the same as it always did, glass and steel reflecting the rising sun. People moving in and out with coffee cups and hurried conversations. But as Sophie walked through the front entrance this time, there was a subtle shift in how she carried herself. Not louder, not more visible, just more certain. The security guard glanced up, did a double take, then gave a small nod instead of the usual distracted wave. And that alone was enough to remind her that things were already changing. She made her way to the elevator, the folder held neatly at her side, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored walls. Same face, same quiet expression, but something underneath it had sharpened. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, the atmosphere changed immediately, quieter, more controlled, conversation softer, footsteps more deliberate. And for a brief moment, she felt it again, that familiar sense of not belonging. But this time, she did not step back from it. She walked forward, steady, until she reached the conference room where a small group had already gathered. Conversations paused when she entered, not abruptly, but noticeably, eyes shifting toward her with curiosity, skepticism, and in some cases, recognition from the day before. Ethan was already there, standing near the far end of the table, speaking with one of his senior managers. But his attention shifted the moment she walked in, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge her presence. "You are on time," he said, and it was not praise, not criticism, just observation. Sophie gave a small nod. "I said I would be," she replied, and again, that steadiness, that refusal to over-explain or soften herself. Ethan gestured toward a seat at the table, not at the far end, not near the door, but among the others, a placement that did not go unnoticed. Sophie hesitated for half a second, then took the seat, setting the folder down in front of her. The room remained quiet for a moment longer before Ethan turned back to the group. "We are revisiting the international proposal," he said, his tone shifting into the focused authority they were used to. "And we will be doing it differently." A subtle tension moved through the room, the kind that comes when established patterns are about to change. He glanced briefly at Sophie, then back at the others. "Miss Bennett will be assisting with translation and analysis." The reaction was immediate, not loud, but present. A slight tightening of expressions, a glance exchanged between two executives, one of them leaning back just enough to signal doubt without saying a word. Sophie noticed it. Of course she did. But she did not react. She simply opened the folder, her fingers steady, her focus already shifting to the work in front of her. Because if there was one thing she understood better than anything else, it was this: respect was not given in rooms like this. It was earned, one moment at a time. The room did not move forward immediately. It hesitated, like a system, adjusting to a variable it had not accounted for. One of the senior managers, a man named Richard Cole, leaned back in his chair with a faint, controlled smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "With all due respect," he said, his tone polished but edged with doubt, "we already have a full team of analysts and translators handling this project." His gaze shifted briefly toward Sophie, then back to Ethan. "I am not sure how additional help will change the outcome." The pause before the last words was deliberate, subtle, but clear enough for everyone to understand. Sophie did not look up. She kept her eyes on the documents in front of her, flipping to the section she had reviewed the night before, her fingers steady, her expression neutral, as if the comment had not been directed at her at all. Ethan did not respond immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to make the room aware of it. Then he spoke. "Then consider this a correction, not an addition," he said, his voice calm, final. And that was enough to end the discussion without raising it into conflict. But it did not erase the skepticism. It simply pushed it beneath the surface, where it lingered, waiting. The meeting resumed. Numbers were presented, projections discussed, strategies debated. And throughout it all, Sophie listened, not passively, not as an outsider, but with a level of focus that filtered through the noise. She began to see the gaps, not because the team was incompetent, but because they were too close to their own assumptions, too invested in their interpretations to question them. And when the conversation circled back to a clause in the international proposal, one that had been debated for nearly 20 minutes without resolution, Sophie spoke, not loudly, not interrupting, but clearly enough that the room paused. "You are translating that clause too literally," she said, her voice even. Richard's expression tightened slightly. "It is a legal document, Miss Bennett," he replied, a faint emphasis on her name. "Precision matters." Sophie lifted her gaze then, meeting his directly. "Exactly," she said. "And in this context, the phrasing implies obligation, not flexibility. If you present it as optional, you weaken your position." The room went still again, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. No hesitation, no apology, just clarity. Ethan watched her closely, not stepping in, not guiding the conversation, simply observing. Richard leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table. "And you are certain?" he asked. And there was a challenge in it now, subtle, but unmistakable. Sophie did not look away. "Yes," she said, and then, without waiting for permission, she reached for one of the printed copies, turning it toward him, pointing to a specific line. "This phrase here," she explained, her tone shifting just enough to carry explanation without condescension. "In this language, it carries contractual weight, not suggestion. If you adjust the translation accordingly, your leverage changes." The analyst who had been taking notes earlier leaned in, scanning the line, then nodded slowly. "She is right," he said quietly. And that was enough, not loud, not dramatic, but definitive. The energy in the room shifted again, not completely, not instantly, but enough to be felt. Richard sat back, his expression neutral now, but The earlier confidence had dimmed just slightly. Ethan finally stepped forward then, not to defend her, not to correct anyone, but to move the conversation forward. "Adjust the draft," he said, his tone decisive. And this time, no one questioned it. Sophie lowered her hand, returning to her seat, her focus already moving to the next section, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the room knew better, because something had changed, not loudly, not completely, but undeniably, and for the first time since she had entered that space, Sophie Bennett was no longer invisible. The meeting did not return to its usual rhythm after that moment. It continued, yes, but with a subtle shift that no one openly acknowledged, the kind of shift that changes how people listen, how they speak, how they choose their words. Sophie could feel it in the pauses between sentences, in the way certain eyes now lingered on her a second longer than before, not with dismissal, but with calculation, and for the first time since she had entered the room, the tension she felt was not about being out of place. It was about being watched, measured, and quietly reassessed. Ethan moved the discussion forward with his usual precision, assigning revisions, adjusting timelines. But every now and then, his gaze would flick towards Sophie, not lingering, not obvious, just enough to confirm what he had already begun to understand, that she was not an anomaly. She was an asset, and more importantly, she was a variable that could change outcomes. The meeting stretched another 40 minutes, each section moving faster now, cleaner, as if the presence of clarity had forced efficiency into the room. And when it finally ended, chairs shifted, papers gathered, quiet conversations resumed in low tones. But something else happened too, something small but significant. One of the analysts approached Sophie, not formally, not ceremoniously, just a brief pause beside her chair. "That point you made," he said, his voice low. "It saved us a lot of trouble." Sophie gave a small nod. "It saved you leverage," she corrected gently. And he almost smiled before walking away. It was not praise she needed, it was accuracy. And that distinction did not go unnoticed. Richard remained seated a moment longer than the others, his fingers tapping once against the table again, a habit Sophie had already identified as a sign of controlled frustration. He looked at her, not openly hostile, not openly respectful, but something in between. "You were prepared," he said, not quite a compliment, not quite a question. Sophie met his gaze calmly. "I read the material," she replied, and that answer, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because it implied effort, discipline, and a standard he could not easily dismiss. Richard gave a short nod, then stood, gathering his papers with a precision that suggested he was already recalibrating his own approach. The room emptied gradually, until only a few remained, and then finally just Sophie and Ethan. The silence that settled between them was not uncomfortable, but it was not casual either. It was the kind of silence that follows a shift in understanding. Ethan moved toward the window, looking out over the city for a moment before speaking. "You changed the direction of that negotiation," he said, not turning around immediately. Sophie closed her folder, her fingers resting lightly on the cover. "I corrected a misinterpretation," she said. And again, that refusal to exaggerate, to claim more than what was true. Ethan turned then, his expression thoughtful. "Most people would have let it go," he said. "It was not their responsibility." Sophie tilted her head slightly, considering that. "If you see something wrong and understand it," she said, "it becomes your responsibility whether you want it or not." Ethan studied her for a moment longer, and this time there was no calculation in his gaze, just recognition, quiet and genuine. "That is a rare perspective," he said. Sophie shrugged lightly. "It is an expensive one," she replied, and for the first time, Ethan actually smiled, not the controlled, practiced expression he used in meetings, but something real, brief, and unexpected. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in the room this time, but between them, something quieter, something that had nothing to do with titles or positions, and everything to do with respect. The quiet that followed did not linger long, because reality had a way of returning quickly in places like this. And with it came structure, expectation, and the invisible lines that defined who belonged where. Ethan moved back toward his desk, his expression settling into something more neutral, more controlled. but not distant, not like before. This changes the timeline, he said, picking up a tablet and scrolling through the updated projections. If we adjust the language in the contract, the negotiation window shortens by at least 2 weeks. Sophie listened, her attention sharp, already connecting the implications. It also changes their perception of urgency, she added, stepping slightly closer to the desk, not intruding, but no longer holding herself at the edge of the room. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then nodded. Exactly, he said, and that single word carried more weight than any formal acknowledgement, because it placed her inside the conversation, not outside of it. He tapped the screen once, bringing up a series of notes. We will need to revise the entire proposal package, he continued. Language, structure, tone, everything. Sophie's gaze moved across the data, her mind already organizing the work into pieces, manageable, actionable. Then we should start with the executive summary, she said. If that is wrong, everything else loses impact. Ethan paused, just for a moment, then gave a small nod, agreed, and again, no hesitation, no need to assert authority, just alignment. But not everyone saw it that way. The door opened quietly behind them, and Richard stepped back in, a folder in hand, his expression composed but tighter than before. I reviewed the adjustment, he said, walking toward the desk, placing the folder down with measured precision. It introduces risk, he added, his tone careful, controlled, but unmistakably resistant. Ethan did not look up immediately. He finished reviewing the note on his screen, then set the tablet down. Everything introduces risk, he said calmly. The question is whether it creates advantage. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze flicking briefly towards Sophie before returning to Ethan. And we are basing that advantage on her interpretation, he said, not raising his voice, but making the point clear. The room felt smaller for a second, not physically, but in tension. Sophie did not step back, did not look away. She simply spoke. Not interpretation, she said, her voice even. Meaning, Richard turned toward her fully now, his expression controlled but sharper. And you are confident enough to stake a multi-million-dollar negotiation on that distinction, he asked, and there it was, the challenge laid bare. Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. If you present it incorrectly, you are already risking more than that. She replied, no defensiveness, no edge, just clarity. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest. Ethan watched both of them, not intervening immediately, allowing the moment to settle, to reveal what it needed to reveal. Then he stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but final. We are moving forward with the revision, he said, not as a debate, not as a discussion, but as a decision. Richard held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a short nod, stepping back. Understood, he said, though the word carried more weight than agreement. He gathered his folder and turned to leave, the door closing quietly behind him. The tension in the room eased just slightly, but not completely. Sophie exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of focus, because she understood something now that had not been clear before. This was not just about proving she belonged. It was about holding her ground once she was seen. Ethan looked at her again, and this time there was no trace of earlier amusement, no curiosity left unresolved, just a quiet certainty. You just made an enemy, he said, not as a warning, but as a fact. Sophie tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. Then I must be doing something right, she replied, and for a brief moment, the corner of Ethan's mouth lifted again, not in humor, but in recognition of something he respected more than he expected. The moment Richard left the room, the air did not fully settle. It shifted into something quieter but more deliberate, the kind of tension that does not disappear but instead becomes part of the structure, something you have to learn to move within. Sophie stood there for a second longer, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk, her mind already recalibrating, not on the confrontation that had just happened, but on what it meant moving forward, because she understood something clearly now. This was no longer about proving her ability. That part had already begun. This was about sustaining it under pressure. Ethan moved around the desk again, stopping a few feet from her, his posture relaxed but his attention sharp. He is not wrong to question you, he said, not as criticism, but as context. Sophie nodded slightly. I would question me too, she replied, her tone calm, and that answer seemed to settle something in him. Most people would take that personally, he said, studying her. Sophie gave a small, almost thoughtful shrug. Most people are trying to protect their position, she said. I am trying to do the work. And again, that distinction, simple but precise. Ethan let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, but close. That is going to make things complicated, he said, and there was no warning in it, just acknowledgement. Sophie met his gaze, steady as always. Simple things rarely change anything, she replied, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The city stretching out behind them, distant and constant. Then Ethan turned back to his desk, picking up a pen, not to write, but to think. We are accelerating the timeline, he said after a second. I want a revised draft of the executive summary by the end of the day. Sophie glanced at the clock on the wall, just past 10 in the morning, then back at him, calculating quickly, not the time, but the work. Then I will need access to the previous drafts and the negotiation notes, she said. Already moving into process. Ethan nodded. You will have it, he replied, tapping a quick command into his system. And I want your version, he added, looking up at her again. Not a correction of theirs. Your version. Sophie held his gaze for a second, understanding exactly what he meant. Not adjustment, not refinement, but ownership. And that was a different level of responsibility entirely. She nodded once. Then that is what you will get, she said. And with that, she turned, not waiting for dismissal, not hesitating, just moving forward, because the moment had already passed, and now it was about execution. The hallway outside felt different this time, not because it had changed, but because she had. The looks she received were no longer confused. They were aware, some curious, some cautious, a few openly skeptical, but none of them dismissed her completely. And that alone was enough to confirm what she already knew. Visibility had a cost, but it also had power. She made her way to a temporary workstation that had been assigned to her, a clean desk near the window, a computer already set up, files beginning to load onto the screen as access was granted. Sophie set the folder down, pulled out her notebook from her bag, the same worn one she had carried for years, placing it beside the keyboard, a small, quiet anchor in a space that was anything but familiar. She sat, took a breath, and began. The documents unfolded in front of her, lines of text, layers of meaning, and for the next several hours, the world narrowed to just that: language, intent, structure. She worked without distraction, without hesitation, rewriting, refining, not to impress, not to prove, but to get it right. And somewhere in the middle of it, without announcement, without recognition, something else happened. Sophie Bennett stopped working like someone who had been given a chance and started working like someone who knew exactly what she was worth. By late afternoon, the office had shifted into a quieter rhythm, the earlier urgency settling into focused movement, screens glowing, keyboards clicking in steady patterns, and at her desk by the window, Sophie remained still except for the precise motion of her hands, her eyes scanning the final lines of the executive summary she had rewritten from the ground up, not as a revision, but as a statement, every sentence intentional, every phrase carrying weight. She paused at the last paragraph, reading it once more, not for grammar, not for structure, but for clarity, for meaning, for the quiet alignment between what was written and what it needed to achieve. Then she leaned back slightly, exhaling a breath she had not realized she was holding, her fingers resting on the edge of her worn notebook, the same one that had followed her through years of silence, of unseen work, of effort that had never been acknowledged. Until now, she saved the document, attached it to a message, and for a brief second, her cursor hovered over the send button, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because once this was sent, it would no longer belong to her. It would be judged, tested, accepted, or rejected, and she understood that process well enough to respect it. Then she clicked send. Simple, final, and just like that, the next phase began. Across the floor, in his office, Ethan's screen lit up with the notification. He opened the file without hesitation, his attention sharpening immediately as he read the first line, and within seconds, he could tell this was not a correction. It was a reconstruction. The tone was sharper, more deliberate. The language carried authority without excess. The structure guided the reader exactly where it needed to go. He moved through the document quickly at first, then slower, more carefully, not because it was confusing, but because it was precise, and precision demanded attention. He reached the final paragraph and stopped, reading it twice, then once more, not searching for flaws, but measuring impact. And when he leaned back in his chair, there was no question left in his mind. He stood immediately, document still open on his tablet, and walked out of his office, the movement drawing subtle attention from those nearby. Conversations lowering as he passed, his pace steady, direct, until he reached Sophie's desk. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm, unchanged, as if she had not just rewritten the foundation of a multi-million-dollar negotiation. Ethan stopped beside her, holding the tablet out slightly, not as an offering, but as a point of focus. "You did not adjust the summary," he said, his voice even. Sophie met his gaze. "No," she replied. "I replaced it." And there it was, no apology, no hesitation, just ownership. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, definitive nod. "Good," he said, and that single word carried more weight than approval. It carried alignment. He turned slightly, addressing no one in particular, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We are using this version." The reaction was immediate, not loud, but present. A shift in posture, a glance exchanged, a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed again. Richard, standing a few desks away, looked up, his expression controlled but unreadable, his eyes moving from the tablet to Sophie, then back to Ethan. He said nothing, but the silence spoke clearly enough. Ethan turned back to Sophie once more, his voice lower now, more focused. "Prepare to walk them through it tomorrow," he said. And this time, it was not a suggestion, it was a step forward. Sophie nodded once, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her desk, steady, grounded. "I will," she replied. And as Ethan walked away, returning to his office without another word, the space around her felt different again, not because of attention, but because of position. She was no longer just present, she was part of the outcome. And as the city outside began to shift into evening, lights flickering on one by one, Sophie Bennett sat quietly at her desk, not celebrating, not reacting, just preparing, because she understood something clearly now. Earning a place was only the beginning. Keeping it required everything she had. The next morning arrived with a clarity that felt sharper than the day before, the kind of clarity that comes when something is about to be tested in the open. Sophie stood at the front of the conference room. The same room where she had once been invisible, the same polished table, the same glass walls, but everything about it felt different now, not because the room had changed, but because her place in it had. The executives were already seated, their attention not scattered this time, but focused, deliberate. Waiting, Richard sat among them, his posture composed, his expression neutral, but his eyes steady, watchful. Ethan stood near the head of the table, not speaking, not directing, simply observing, and that alone shifted the dynamic, because he was not leading this moment. She was. Sophie placed her notes on the table, though she did not look at them, her hands resting lightly against the edge, grounding herself not in preparation, but in understanding. She did not rush to fill the silence, she allowed it to settle. Then she began, her voice calm, clear, carrying through the room without effort. She did not read the summary. She walked them through it, explaining not just what had changed, but why it mattered, how the revised language repositioned their leverage, how the structure guided the negotiation toward a stronger outcome. She spoke in a way that did not perform knowledge, but demonstrated it. Each point connected, each explanation precise. And as she moved through the document, the room responded, not with interruption, not with dismissal, but with attention, real attention, the kind that listens not for mistakes, but for meaning. Richard asked the first question, not to challenge, but to test. If they push back on the obligation clause, how do we respond without losing ground? Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. "You do not respond immediately," she said. "You let the language stand, because it is already aligned with standard practice. If you soften it, you signal uncertainty." The answer landed, not dramatically, but effectively. Richard gave a small nod, not agreement, not concession, but acknowledgement, and that was enough. The discussion continued, Questions sharper now, more specific, and Sophie answered each one with the same steady clarity, not trying to win, not trying to impress, just guiding the conversation where it needed to go. And somewhere in the middle of it, something shifted completely, not in one moment, but in a series of small recognitions. The way people stopped glancing at Ethan for confirmation, the way they directed their questions to her instead, the way the room began to move with her rather than around her. And Ethan saw it all. He did not interrupt, did not redirect, because he understood exactly what was happening. This was not a performance. This was a transition. When the final question was answered, the room fell quiet again, not uncertain, not tense, but settled, the kind of quiet that comes when something has been resolved. Sophie paused, her hands resting lightly on the table, then stepped back, not claiming the moment, not holding on to it, just allowing it to exist. Ethan stepped forward then, his presence returning to the center of the room, but not to take control, to acknowledge it. He looked at the group, then at Sophie, and his voice, when he spoke, was calm, clear, and final. "We move forward with this strategy," he said, and there was no hesitation, no doubt, just decision. The meeting ended shortly after, chairs shifting, conversations resuming, but the tone was different now, quieter, more aligned. As people began to leave, a few paused near Sophie, brief words, small nods, nothing exaggerated, but enough to mark the change. Richard approached last, his expression composed, his gaze steady. "You held your ground," he said, and for the first time, there was no edge in his voice. Sophie met his gaze. "That was the point," she replied, and he gave a short nod before walking away. And just like that, the resistance shifted into something else, not acceptance, not fully, but respect, the kind that is earned, not given. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the room empty. Then he turned to her, his expression thoughtful, quieter than before. "You did more than prove yourself," he said. "You changed how they see you." Sophie held his gaze, steady, grounded. "That was never the goal," she said, and he understood that immediately, because the goal had never been perception, it had been truth. And as the last of the room cleared and the city beyond the windows stretched into another day, something settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Sophie Bennett was no longer someone who had been given a chance. She was someone who had taken it, shaped it, and made it undeniable.